Hey everyone, I just played Sludge Life, and I've got to ask, why is this game banned? Developed by Adam Drucker and Terry Velman and published by Devolver Digital in 2020, Sludge Life is a crass anti-capitalist graffiti simulator set in a world of rampant poverty, unchecked pollution, and runaway profits that is currently refused classification in Australia. And since a piece of media can't be bought or sold without a classification in Australia, that means it's effectively banned. Which is really funny because I didn't know that until I sat down to make this video. I thought it was weird how it wasn't available on Steam when its sequel, Sludge Life 2, was, but I just assumed the developers had forgotten to set a regional price in dollary dues, something that does still occasionally happen. And the unavailability certainly didn't stop me from playing it. It was only while recording the game for this video, when I went to check online for help on how to reach a particularly out-of-the-way tag spot, that I discovered Sludge Life Australia was among the top autocomplete results on Google, and out of curiosity went to see what all the fuss was about, and thus discovered the game was effectively banned. Oops. Bit of an oversight on my part, but I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Australia has a rich and ridiculous history of banning games for one reason or another. But Sludge Life? Really? This? Why? I have to know. So let's find out. But before I get my hands into the guts of this game, this video and everything I make on the channel is now made possible by the generous people supporting me on Patreon. So if you like what I do and want to see more, please consider donating. And if you don't want to give Patreon money or can't support monthly, Ko-Fi is also an option. Links are in the description. And if financial support isn't possible but you still want to help the channel grow, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and share the video around because YouTube sure won't. Also, I've joined BlueSky. You can find me here if you want. Come say hi. Anyway, let's get to it. This is Sludge Life. Sludge Life puts you in the shoes of Ghost, a graffiti artist looking to paint the town neon green while everyone's either distracted or apathetic during the biggest strike in living memory. The world is your canvas to tag as you please, but it's also teeming with a cast of odd yet memorable characters that give the miserable place a bit more life than you might expect. It's also a world overflowing with weird little things to find and see and do. Sludge Life isn't a particularly long experience. You can get through everything the game has to offer in around 2.5 to 3 hours, but it never outstays its welcome, and it's certainly never boring. What I find interesting is that Sludge Life doesn't actually have that much of a goal. There are 3 endings to find, each with their own unique challenges to overcome, but none of them strike me as being the point of playing the game. Even when you find them, you're just thrown back into the world right where you left it once you close the credits screen. Instead, it's the world itself that's really the point in playing Sludge Life. Tagging every available surface might justify the exploration, but the graffiti was never the reward. The strange things I found along the way, the odd people I met on the journey, the unexpected payoffs to weird little details in random conversations. That was what made Sludge Life so compelling. A woman at this shop mentions seeing a muscle mommy steal a washing machine right off the wall, and here she is hanging out with her stolen goods. One of the apartment tenants mentions having lost his pet snakes, not that he wants them back, just to let everyone know that they're loose. And sure enough, the world is overflowing with the things. They can even send a ghost straight to a hospital bed if you don't keep an ear out for the occasional hiss. There's a big stink at the plaza about how the Glug statue accidentally crushed a beloved mascot, and you can meet the sculptor having an existential crisis in his studio on the other side of the map. If someone brings some seemingly random thing up in conversation, there's a good chance you'll be able to find it yourself if you search hard enough, and I love that attention to detail. It makes the world feel real and alive and interconnected, despite how small it is in practice. Not every single example of this landed. The janitor at the local Bergamon joint talking up an admittedly large turd you can find in the bathrooms was just a little too crass for me, but for the most part, I couldn't get enough. And for all the weird little things set up ahead of time, there were just as many that came completely out of nowhere. A chef nonchalant about having stuck a knife through her hand, the animal people you can meet like Big Mud, and this bird guy still working at the Glug research facility despite the strike. They're not a filthy scab, they're just hoping people will assume they work there once the strike ends and start paying them. This guy several days into a sick head spin, and oh look, it's Peter Dutton! He's right behind the giant baby, I swear. It's just such a weird world, but it's put together in such a way that it maintains the suspension of disbelief from start to finish, and that's before you get into the writing. There are some absolutely unhinged conversations to be had in Sludge Life, like this guy in the showers, or this idiot at the gym, or this woman who's somehow stuck hanging from a girder who worries her hair is ruined. But there are just as many incredibly relatable chats you can have with people who hate their jobs and want more out of life. It's a game that isn't afraid to get into the muck of how strange and unglamorous life can be, and Sludge Life's personality shines as a result, but that doesn't make it any less rough around the edges. Sludge Life is a game about making the most of things while living in the shit, and wow, is there a lot of feces to find. To say nothing of how edgy it can get, and whether or not you'll vibe with the game, I think comes down to how much you're willing to tolerate the toilet humour and edgy jokes. But for me at least, it managed to find the perfect balance. Most of the time. If only because it's still surprisingly hopeful. The world of Sludge Life isn't content to wallow in self-pity for how many characters are depressed or stuck in a rut. They're still willing to fight to make things better, or find relief however they can. Even outside the graffiti, Ghost is given the option to spit in the Glug CEO's dinner while sneaking through their tower. It's a game that captures the anger of the times without feeling disingenuous or corporate or sanitized. And while it's not difficult to find the same sorts of sentiments bandied about online, it is nice to see them reflected so aggressively and sincerely in a piece of media. There's no real goal to work toward in Sludge Life because there's no real way to solve the issues at the heart of its conflict. All you can do is what you can, even if that's just tagging a few walls and spitting in some food. Big budget representations of similar situations often end with the rebels winning out over the big evil corporations. But that's rarely how it works in reality, and Sludge Life not only understands that, but is sick of pretending it's the norm. And god, that's cathartic. It's a game that could only come out of the indie scene with its identity and personality intact. It's a personality that extends beyond the writing and world building too. Sludge Life has a very bold art style, all stark shapes and flat colours, that recalls smooth and sanitized corporate graphic design with just enough detail to show off the grime. The palette is muted most of the time, lots of greys and browns and greens, but when the colour does pop, it really fucking pops. Everything is so stylized that nothing ever feels out of place. Not the humans, not the non-humans, not even the giant baby. And it really comes alive despite the fact there's very little movement in the NPCs. Most are just hanging out, sometimes literally. Only a privileged few are given walk cycles. Everything is a little crunchy and pixelated, but there's still enough fidelity to make the details stand out, especially when it comes to the graffiti covering the entire world. The menus seem a bit bland by comparison until you realise it's all diegetic. You're actually just browsing Ghost's laptop, which is then tossed aside whenever you go back to the game, and you don't even need to pick it up to keep using it either. All of the items are like that, but the laptop is special in my opinion because it's treated as part of the world. There are pop-ups to close, and extra programs to find and install like the minimap, which is an actual satellite hanging above the game world that physically moves as you scroll through the program, and even a counter that tells you how much medical debt you're in after each accident, which is just pitch perfect. But where Sludge Life really excels in terms of presentation is the sound design. Everything is so crisp and clear, from the rattle of the spray cans to the hiss of the occasional snake to the snap of the shutter on the camera you've stolen to take pictures. Everyone speaks like they're from a 90s rare collectathon. But what's fun is that in the game's own lore, they're actually speaking a language called Sludge, while the songs you can listen to are canonically in English. Another great little attention to detail, and needless to say, the music's great, especially Big Mud's mixtape. No wonder he became such an important character in the sequel. I especially love how his eyes close whenever you hit pause. Very fun. And that's all well and good, but none of it actually explains why Sludge Life ended up slapped with a ban. It's not illegal to be edgy or crass, which just leaves the gameplay. Most of Sludge Life's mechanics are devoted to movement. Aside from your basic walk, run, and jump options, you can climb certain terrain elements on loan from the dreaded yellow school of game design. You can swoosh through narrow gaps in windows or doors, and climb through vents, all in service of making your way to your next masterpiece. Just don't fall into the sludge, because climbing out again is not easy. There are a bunch of items to find that aid in exploration too, like a glider that can carry you halfway across the map with a good enough jump from a high enough place, and if you're stuck looking for the last couple of bare walls, there's a jar of eyes that you can find that will point you in the right direction, which is, I've got to admit, a little odd, but there are also items like the camera which are just included for the hell of it. Hope you're ready for some holiday pics. When you're not tagging the walls, Sludge Life is happy to let you goof around with random crap, shoot some hoops, install and play an entirely separate game called Crypt Creeper, hunt down and devour every banana slug on the planet. The world is your oyster as much as it is your canvas. Crypt Creeper isn't just a random little aside either. It's a proper game with actual mechanics, and while the balance might be a little scuffed, it's perfectly playable all on its own. Even if everyone in-universe apparently hates it. It all boils down to very basic addition and subtraction. You have to keep your health and armor up while avoiding enemies too beefy for whatever weapon you're carrying around, and it's more than I expected from a side game in an indie title. I said before that Sludge Life doesn't have a goal, but I will grant that it does have a progression path. Ghost isn't the only graffiti artist in the game. You can run into your peers all over the place, but they won't be open to a sick multi-story collab unless you cross a certain threshold of spots tagged. There are 100 places to graffiti in total, and the other artists will offer to collaborate every 20 or so. I think it's fun how some of them start off as Ghost's friends, while others think they're a waste of time until you, as the player, prove them wrong. But either way, the collaborations are great rewards for a job well done. It's not easy to get that nice fat 100 either. A lot of the graffiti spots are located well out of reach without the help of the glider, or some other item. You'll always know they're there because phantom blue spray paint cans will appear with a rattle to announce their presence, but getting to them is another thing entirely. It's dangerous work, especially before you get the glider, since a long drop can often end in a sudden stop. You can't die, and racking up a medical debt doesn't actually affect gameplay, but getting dragged out to the nearest clinic is an absolute pain in the arse if you were trying to get to some out-of-the-way place. The game does have a fast travel system to mitigate this. There are a bunch of teleporters hidden all across the environment, and the ones atop the two container stackers were especially lifesavers given how time-consuming they are to climb, but you still have to search them out to activate them, and they don't cover absolutely everywhere in the game. Even then, some of the graffiti spots aren't dangerous to reach, they're just difficult, like this one on the underside of a satellite dish. When the solution to this one clicked, it was great. I wish there were more puzzles like it in the game. Fingers crossed for the sequel, which I have yet to play. So, why ban Sludge Life? From everything we've looked at, it just seems like a graffiti-based collectathon with a lot of personality and a little edge. Well, every so often you can stumble across some spicy mushrooms that will take you places when imbibed, and yep, that'd do it. The Australian Classification Board is notoriously strict about drug use in video games. It's the reason why Fallout 3 was almost banned here, and indeed, why the in-game drugs were renamed from real-life substances to made-up ones in every release overall, way back in 2008. It's the reason Disco Elysium was initially refused classification before an appeal knocked it down to an R18+ rating in 2021. It's the reason why We Happy Few went through the same process in 2018. So much as look at a drug in any mechanical, interactive way, and you're walking out with a big fat refused classification slapped on your head. Which is really funny in Sludge Life's case, because all that happens when you partake is the screen starts to warp, you fly through the air for a little bit, and then you crash back to reality and hurl your guts out all over Ghost's shoes wherever you were standing when you first took the devil's mushroom. It's not exactly intense, but that's all it apparently takes. What's funny is that Sludge Life was actually available for a full year in Australia before it was refused classification by the board, and the board only took an interest because Sludge Life was going to get a physical release on Nintendo Switch. The same thing happened with Disco Elysium, and We Happy Few, and RimWorld, all available for years digitally, only to be banned over an impending physical release. Even if these three examples were eventually granted an R18+ rating on appeal. Sludge Life made no such attempt, and so remains unavailable to be bought or sold in Australia to this day, which, given its themes, honestly feels kind of appropriate. And you may well ask, but Monotom, you live in Australia, and you still manage to play it, to which I say, what are you, a cop? And to anyone wanting to comment down below, well, I'm in Australia and I found it available at Springle's Game Sprongle, don't. I already knew I wanted to talk about Sludge Life because it's an enjoyable game with a tone that really resonated with me, but after learning it was banned here, I realised I needed to talk about it, because it's a perfect example of how the Australian government is out of touch with modern media. Books, movies, TV shows, and music all do occasionally get refused classification for one reason or another, but it's rare. More often than not, they'll just have the offending content removed and released with a lower rating. Gladiator 2 is a recent example that comes to mind, but it's a lot easier to cut out a few seconds of gore from a movie, or just not allow an episode of a TV show, or sell a book in plain packaging under the counter. It's a lot harder to edit mechanics out of a video game without breaking the whole thing, and it's a lot harder to argue their lack of impact given it's an interactive medium. But on top of that, I feel there's still the stigma that video games are a bad influence on today's youth, and when I was yesterday's youth, it left me fuming. How dare they keep me from playing some mediocre console shooter like, I don't know, Dark Sector. But now that I'm today's old bag, it just leaves me tired. Video games especially have always been treated here as something intended solely for children, to the point that until the early 2010s, they couldn't even be given an R18+ rating. The maximum a game could get was MA15+, and even once that changed, it didn't actually quell the number of titles refused classification all that much. Wikipedia even has a page dedicated solely to the topic. Refusedclassification.com, which is unrelated to the board, I should say, actually keeps an impressive, though given Sludge Life's absence, incomplete record of every piece of media refused classification or censored in Australia, along with the reasons why. And while perusing the website, I discovered one of the reasons Disco Elysium's ban was overturned on appeal is because, quote, the review board also considered the appeal of the game to be skewed toward an adult audience, end quote. Yeah. No shit, Disco Elysium is skewed toward an adult audience. It's such a bizarre statement. It's like something an alien would write while trying to understand human culture, but it says so much about the thought process behind the decision, as if there's just an assumption on the board's part that every video game submitted to them is angling for a G rating. And reading through the guidelines, a lot of the language is framed around protecting minors, or addressing community concerns about offensive material. well. A proper nuanced examination of video game censorship in Australia is, I think, beyond the scope of this little review project on Sludge Life, but it's still an examination worth making and a discussion worth having, to say nothing of what happened last year when the Australian government introduced a world-first social media ban to stop kids from accessing violent content and curtail cyberbullying, that will also require legal adults to confirm their identities with websites in order to maintain access to them. A whole other can of worms that I'm not even qualified to open, much less unpack. My point is, censorship is alive and well in Australia, and one of the places where its presence burns the brightest in the modern media landscape is still video games. The implementation of an R18+ rating for video games back in the 2010s was a victory. Without it, things like Disco Elysium would never have been released here at all. But why even have it when titles explicitly aimed at adults, such as Sludge Life, are still being banned on the basis of their content not being suitable for children, or offensive to the community at large? That content is what an R18+ rating should be for, and it's especially frustrating when sometimes the content in question is just this. God, I love a sunburnt nanny state. Sludge Life is a fun little game, but it's not one anyone in Australia can experience without committing a crime anymore, knowingly or otherwise. It's a game that's not afraid to be a little offensive, a little crude, a little crass. It doesn't shy away from how grimy life can get, or the psychedelic ways people sometimes use to escape that grit. And that was apparently enough for it to be turned away at the door, or at least thrown out after hiding at the back of the room for a little while. But what a breath of fresh air it is, when so often similar titles with similar themes feel so sterile and corporate by comparison. There are things in Sludge Life that I, personally, find offensive, mainly the toilet humour and the edgy content, but I don't think the game should be banned or censored as a result. I will simply just not engage with those aspects of the title, and at worst, criticise their inclusion, but I would never take them out. Sludge Life is such a striking expression of modern urban malaise, such a clear and obvious vision from the developers that without those offensive aspects, it would shine a little less bright overall. I've never partaken in graffiti, or, you know, the other thing, but I still love how well Sludge Life hears and understands my frustration with the way things are right now. A frustration that's shared by a lot of people. It doesn't really have a solution to those frustrations, but it does offer a safe place to vent them without risk of real-world legal repercussions. At least for a little while, at least if you're not in Australia. Ahem. It's one of the most unique collectathons I've ever played, and if you're able to give it a go, I'd highly recommend it. Thanks for watching. And that's the video. Before I go, I'd like to thank by name the people supporting me with $5 US a month or more on Patreon. Azazel, Cass, Hawkwing2652, Heymatey, Jeffiet, Marcy May, Kat, Sarah Bloomer, Sneezy McGlassface, Space Quest Historian, This Sauerkraut, Ursa, I hope that's not too mangled, and Zeke the Phantom. Thank you so much. So, you don't know how hard I had to rein myself in on this one. The number of times I had to completely rewrite the chapter on game censorship in Australia could make a whole extra video of the same length, because there's just so much to talk about. I think at some point I'll have to do a deep dive into the topic, but not this year. I've got enough big projects on my plate at the moment. Some wild shit to talk about on that front though, you have no idea. Anyway, the next video is going to be on something a little less serious, though no less unhinged. Look out for that next month. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.